Welcome to Anatomy of Failure, the podcast where we dive deep into the real stories behind entrepreneurial challenges and explore how failure can shape success. I'm your host, Ivy Walker, and today I'm joined by Jeanette Jordan, an experienced executive coach and startup mentor. Jeanette shares powerful insights on strategies for reframing fear and limiting beliefs, building self-awareness, and taking actionable steps to become a stronger, more effective leader. Think you can't raise capital or worried that you can't quit that 9-to-5 to launch that new venture? Jeanette's insights might be just what you need to hear. Whether you're just starting out or looking to break through the next big challenge, this episode is packed with tools to help you move past obstacles and lead with confidence. Ready to get started? Let's dive in. Welcome to Anatomy of Failure. I'm Ivy Walker, your podcast host, and with me today is Jeanette Jordan. Jeanette, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So we wanted to talk today about fear and your role as a coach in working with entrepreneurs who are dealing with that fear. But before we dive in, why don't you give our viewers and our listeners just a little bit of your background?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. I'm a full-time executive coach and startup mentor advisor. I've been doing this work for over 10 years, but I've been doing it full-time for about the past 5 years. I come into coaching from being an operator in the tech industry myself. I'm a former CMO and COO, and I started my career, I did over a decade in tech at a lot of high-growth startups. So I know firsthand what it's like to be in a venture-backed high-growth startup, which has a lot of pressure. And sometimes they also don't necessarily have the resources to have L&D or have training. Or sometimes you have people who got in early career and don't have a lot of management experience. So I feel like I learned a lot of hard lessons throughout my career. And I want to spend this phase of my career giving back.
Well, that's fantastic because a lot of business owners, whether they be startup or they've been in business for a long time, can benefit from coaching expertise, and having a wide range of experiences, as you just listed, really would inform your insights as to how you would approach coaching people through various different challenges. I highly recommend that people seek out a coach, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So to start with, in our first episode of this podcast, I had a conversation with a fellow entrepreneur and friend of mine, Khalid Patrice. We talked about the fear of failure and how it has shaped our entrepreneurial journey. In particular, the fear of failure showed up for me as one kind of walking away from a venture when it was still on its way up, but I knew that the business model wasn't sustainable and was kind of afraid of what that would look like if it failed on my watch, and wanted to bring in somebody that I thought would have a better chance of fixing it. That didn't turn out to be the case. I ended up having to wind down the company, come back and wind down the company myself after spending another 18 months trying to salvage it. But really, that fear of failure for me, not wanting to admit that what the market was telling me and not wanting to face that myself was how it showed up for me. And for Khalid, it showed up as not launching a product that she is eminently qualified to launch. And so we talked about what that looked like for the two of us. As a coach, how have you seen the fear of failure show up in some of the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great examples. I do think that the fear to start is one. It's one that I've grappled with personally. And I see a lot of people who have an idea, who sit in their careers for a while, who are afraid to leave the comfort of a corporate job to get started. So I definitely think that that's one flavor of a fear of failure. I think the other is actually knowing when to start to move and pivot the business, right? And I heard you you touch on that a little bit. But if something's not working, if you had this idea and you get so attached and married to this idea, but there's no momentum and no market signals and no traction, the ability to actually move off of that idea, the fear of failing or letting really go of this thing that you've gotten attached to, can be another type of fear of failure. I would also say a big fear of failure is not having like the comfort and support of familiar people around you. Sometimes we get started with people in our network and people we know and people we went to school with, right? But they might not be the most qualified people or might not be the most qualified people at the stage of company that you're at, right? And so something I often say to the founders I coach is like, what do you have to give up to grow, right? Sometimes people who helped you get started are not the people for growth mode, who are not the people for maintenance mode, who are not the people for turnaround mode. So each season requires a different kind of level from you and from your team. And so knowing when to let go of the familiar and get people who have a specific skill set and expertise is another kind of failure.
So those are really good examples. As we think about the way failure can show up in an enterprise, and especially at the different stages of the enterprise. It could be the failure to launch. It could be the failure to raise capital. It could be the failure of the enterprise overall. It could be a failure of a key hire, right? So there's so many different ways that things can go wrong. In your experience working with founders, what are some of the operating patterns or some of the behavior patterns that can come into play when the specter of failure starts to rear its head?
Yeah, one big one that I see is indecision. Right? Not able to make a decision. And I often feel like, especially if you've gotten started and had any kind of success, right? You're smart, you know how to make the call. Indecision is really a sign you may know what to do, but something is like holding you back from actually moving in that direction. And it tends to be fear, lack of confidence, somewhere in that realm of what's holding you back. You know what you should do, but for whatever reason, you either feel afraid to move or you're being pulled in a different direction.
Yeah. Another thing that I've seen in my own experience is when that failure, the specter of failure starts to make its appearance, leaders can become more blaming of subordinates, right? Looking for something other than what might actually be the cause, or people aren't working hard enough, or whatever it might be. Have you seen that in your experience where the blame game starts to ramp up as things start to go sideways?
Absolutely. I think the blame game can be a really big problem. I think anytime a leader is unwilling to be self-reflective and start to think about what they are contributing to this situation and dynamic first, I think can be a red flag. You are the leader, so ultimately the buck stops with you is number one. Number two, you set the tone and the dynamic within your organization. So I think you also need to be responsible for that. And then the third thing is, I don't think you can expect you from other people, right? You founded this. This is your baby. You're going to get the most return. So expecting people to show up and work like you is just something that I think is absolutely unrealistic. I think that they can work hard, but nobody's going to be you.
So again, in your work with founders, as you think about the root causes of a fear of failure. So I spent some time doing a lot of psychological work, I'll say, on my what led to being afraid to fail. Failure in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? It's just a step on the path. We live in a culture, though, that really hides failure and celebrates success, right? Failure tends to be a footnote in a larger story. But without really understanding the role that failure plays, we sort of shortchange ourselves from the lessons and the experience. When I look back on my own trajectory on my own journey, I realized that it was stemming from my childhood and the experiences I had as a child, and how failure, or the thought of failure, was sort of treated and ingrained in me. What have you seen in the founders that you've worked with?
Absolutely. I was going right to the childhood too. I think fear is learned behavior, right? And I think about that. If you watch kids, right, they're in their own world. They're willing to walk in the street, without looking around. There is a funny TikTok video going around of a little girl who's like, I want to pet the dog, but it's a black bear, right? So fear is actually a learned behavior. You had to learn it was a hot stove. You had to learn to look both ways before you cross the street. And depending on who your caregivers were, right, their level of fear, their level of anxiety sometimes gets passed to us. So I think childhood is a big one. But also, if you were special enough to not be weighed down with a fear of failure in your childhood, you might grow up and then have an experience, right, that catches you off guard. You're in a workplace. You always expected it to go right, to go well, and then it didn't. And that knocks you off your center. And now you have a big fear of not feeling that kind of pain again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the lessons from fear are important, but how we integrate those lessons, I think, is just as important, right? So learning that the stove is hot. So if you're going to touch the stove, you protect your hand, as opposed to never ever touch a stove, period, right?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
We got to take it a little bit to the extreme. Tell us about your journey as an entrepreneur and how fear of failure may have shown up for you.
Oh my gosh, I am such a reluctant entrepreneur. I started working in my business full time. And when I did that, I found a voice note to myself from 10 years earlier about why I should start my coaching business and how much I enjoyed helping people push past, really hard moments in their career. And then I put it away and I ignored it because I was afraid. I think that there is a fear of failure, but I also think for me, it was the ego. Like it was the fear of judgment and letting go of what people think. I worked at corporate companies. I had some good brand names. I had some good titles. Letting that all go. I never grew up hearing anybody being like, I want to be a coach. Right? You want to be the C-suite title. You want to be the star player, right? I think a coach is an important role, but for me, the fear of judgment, expectation, could I make as much money as I was doing? Could I support myself? Would I be respected? Had me wait 10 years to start. And what actually came of it is I feel like I started getting to a point of failure / burnout in other things. I was over here being like, oh, I need to climb the corporate ladder and be in my C-suite jobs. And I kept burning out because I don't think it was truly my passion. And I don't think it's truly what I was meant to be doing. So when I needed that extra push and extra energy to do it, especially working at startups, that was depleting for me. Yeah. Versus in my business, what I'm doing is not only my passion, I truly believe it's my calling. And it is replenishing for me. I can work a ton of hours. I can be in back-to-back meetings and I feel charged up and I feel ready to go. That's not to say I'm not like a toxic work person. Breaks are important, but I can see the difference of like when I am in my zone of genius, I have way more energy to do the work and to do the things. When I'm operating outside of that, it takes a whole different energetic output that I could not sustain. And the higher you go, the more is required of you. And so through burning out multiple times and feeling like I was failing at what I thought I should be doing caused me to look at the very obvious door. And it was through coaching. I had an executive coach just like, you keep trying this corporate, you keep going back and keep getting the same results. When are you going to look at that? Coaching is staring you in the face and maybe you should just try it. And so it was really helpful to actually have, for me, coaching in an outside perspective to encourage me move me in that direction. And one of my biggest fears was around finances and money. And I had a coach who was just so gracious to actually share her price list, right? Tell me how she was doing it as a single mom in the Bay Area and how she could make it. And so that she knew I could make it too. She would review my proposals in early days and tell me, am I pricing too high? Am I pricing too low? So really for me, pushing past it was like having an objective perspective to actually call out what it was, which was fear, right? And then having a supportive community to help me move through it.
So that's really interesting and powerful, because one of the things that I've said when I was talking to one of my investors, and he commented that he didn't think I had a fear of failure. And I said to him, I said, no, I do. I just can't work for other people. And that inability to work for other people is stronger than the fear of failure, right? So to your point, what you're saying is you keep doing all these other things, and the amount of energy and effort required to try to succeed at those things is just purely, it's not sustainable. Yeah. Because it's not really aligned with who or what you are innately and authentically. And so you kind of get this counterweight between, well, you got this fear of failure, but you also can't work for other people. So one of these things has to give way. One of these things can't remain. So it's really important for people who are struggling with a failure to launch because their fear of failure is really important to think about all the excess energy they are expending trying to maintain whatever it is they think is their safety, and not really moving forward into what it is they really want to be doing. One of the things that I like to talk to people about when I used to be a coach myself, I would say you've got as much risk working for somebody else as you have working for yourself. The problem is you delude yourself into thinking that there's something safer about working for either a large business or a small business. The thing is, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And they're not always transparent with you. And sometimes it's not even that things aren't going well that leads them to let people go. It's that they just want to increase profits, right? Yeah. And so you've got as much or more, in my opinion, you actually have more risk, because if I know what's going on, then I can make changes that will positively impact the outcome of the situation. So that I really love that answer. Thank you for that. As you think about coaching frameworks, when you're working with founders and you think about coaching frameworks, can you talk to us a little bit about how you approach dealing with the fear of failure, identifying it, understanding it, and all those things?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I do is, one, it's really important to start asking open and honest questions, right? So as someone is, presenting an issue or a challenge to me, I am listening and I'm kind of probing for, okay, well, what is the root cause of this feeling or the challenge, right? When did it start is another big one that I ask. So it's like, hey, did this challenge, did this issue, did this, if we don't know its fear yet, start in this particular role, or did it start before this, right? Because that can also give you a hint to what's going on. I often use a reframing exercise when we get to a fear, a limiting belief, things of that sort, which is having people actually name or write down the statement. So the fear, right? I'm afraid that I actually cannot fundraise. Right. And so I take them through an exercise of what else could be true. Right. And then we start listing, usually in more quantity, what else could be true. Maybe you can raise, maybe you have before. Right. And so we start actually looking for experience and facts that might give alternative narratives. Right. So that they have something to hold on to. Right. Because you made a really good point about fear. Right. You became an entrepreneur, and it's not because you didn't have fear. You did it anyway. way. And I really appreciate, even in my story, when I was working with a coach, it's like, it's not that you're not going to have fear. But she used to always tell me fear doesn't need to be in the driver's seat, right? It doesn't need to be making decisions. You could put fear in the passenger seat. You could put fear in the back seat. You could put it in the trunk, right? You can move through the fear, right? So one of the things that I really try to do with the reframing exercise is give people counter narratives. And usually it takes, anywhere from 5 to 7 positive statements to counteract a negative one. So the practice is when you hear yourself telling that story, that you actually start practice immediately jumping in to a counter narrative. Right? I don't think I can raise that money. Yeah. But actually, I have raised money before. I saw a peer raise money. I'm seeing my industry starting to trend, right? So that it's not that you're trying to stop it from coming up, but that you have a way to start to counteract and move through it anyway.
So now you're really touching on the power of the personal narrative or the personal storytelling. We're always telling ourselves stories. Yes. Whenever anything happens, we're always telling ourselves a story. This happened because that person did this, or because this person feels that way, or because the universe doesn't like me. Whatever that personal narrative is, we are interpreting what happens and we're wrapping a story around it. And that story is everything. Right. Yes. And so how can we incorporate this as a habit, as a learned skill, as a daily practice, reframing the stories that we're telling ourselves? How can we even identify when we're telling ourselves a story that may not be true?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll take one piece, which is like, how can we retell ourselves a different story? I think one real common way is you hear people say affirmations, right? Like an affirmation is a way, it is a method of retraining ourselves to tell ourselves a different story, right? To intentionally tell ourselves a different story, right? I think the other piece of your question is kind of identifying the story. And I remember kind of going through my coach training. And one of the most powerful questions I got was, I was thinking about, I was in a job that was a good job. I was making money. I was good at it. And I was going through this coach training just as a hobby, just in case, right? And I went through this powerful coaching session. And to my surprise, I blurted out, I hate my job. And it almost startled me because I didn't necessarily let myself believe that. And as the coach went down, I was like, well, I can't do it for this and I can't do it for that and I can't do it. And they asked me, whose story is that?
Oh, that's a really good question.
And it just stopped me in my tracks. Like, is that actually your story? Or is that a story that you have been told? Because again, parents were nervous because, your next door neighbor failed a business, right? You need to really evaluate, is it your story? Or is this a story that you have learned, that you've inherited, that you have taken on where it's not actually really yours? And that to me is so powerful. And I've started to adopt that practice, which is like identifying not only the story that you're telling yourself, but whose story is it? And is that story in service of you and your goals?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. So when I confronted my own fear of failure, one of the things that I had to realize is that the story I was telling myself is that to fail means you're not smart. To fail means you're not good enough. To fail means that you weren't the person to do the thing, and that's bad on you, right? Yeah. And I went through this exercise where I said, okay, what if that's true? Right? Yeah. What if that's true? What if it's true that I'm not as smart as I think I am? Mm-hmm. What if it's true if I'm not as talented as I think I am? What does that mean? I can learn better skills. I can take lessons away from this and apply them differently. Like, there are positives that even come out of that. And then I went through the process of saying, but what objective evidence counteracts these notions that this would be true? What are the objective facts that I can point to? Not my own thinking or my own story, but what are the objective facts that I can point to that say that this isn't true? And what I realized is once I was able to decharge the emotion around what it meant in my child's mind, because that's what it was. It was a concept of failure that formed me as a child. So in my child's mind, what that failure meant, once I took the emotion away from it, it didn't have any power anymore. It was like, oh, okay, well, that's what happens. You fail and then you move on. It's not a big deal. It's something that you can learn from. So when we think about daily practices, because this is something that I found important, do you have daily practices that you would recommend for founders to counteract either the fear of failure or whatever kind of fear or negative narratives they're telling themselves?
Yeah, two different things come to mind. Your story brought up one that I do with a lot of founders, which is what's the worst that can happen? And I just want you to ask yourself about 5 to 7 times, right? So, okay, I don't think I could raise money. Great. What's the worst that can happen? I need to find other forms of capital. Okay, what's the worst that can happen? I may not be operating, in the business structure I thought it would. Okay, what's the worst that can happen, right? And we take it down. And a lot of times you do realize that this fear is almost like a boogeyman in the closet, right? We get down to what's the worst that can happen. Okay, if I close the business, I need to go get a new job. Okay, you've gotten 15 jobs in your life before. That's actually not that scary. So if you don't actually just want to go get a new job, then it's less scary to just try this thing because you already know what the worst thing that can happen and you are prepared for it. Or if you're not prepared for it, then I practice with some people who have a lot of trouble letting go of fear initially to then get prepared, right? Like, okay, if you think you need to start looking, right? Update your resume, like do that. And a lot of times they will find that the energy that they're like, ooh, I look for a job. I don't want to go back there. I don't want that, to happen. And then they get a little bit more motivated to stay in the lane that they're in. So I think it's a very easy and you can kind of do it wherever you are. You can write it down. You could just do it audibly. What's the worst that can happen is one good practice. The other one, it's really starting to quiet your mind. I was just reflecting on my year. I like to do a year in review type of thing for my business. And one of the workshops that was really popular this year that wasn't popular in previous years was kind of mental fitness. I took a lot of people through this exercise, entrepreneurs and specifically called PQ reps or positive intelligence, right? And there are these different methods. It's like moving meditation where you start to try to quiet your mind and quiet the chatter. And you can do it in short bursts, like 2 minutes, right? And so some of them are like more familiar to us, like breathing exercises, right? Can you just sit and start to breathe, for 2 minutes and start to quiet your mind? But one of the ones that I really love is called tactile, right? You can rub your fingers together and you do it with so much intention. You can feel your fingerprint, right? And you just do this for 2 minutes and you can start to kind of feel your nervous system regulating, right? I kind of say it's like your engine is overheating and you need to kind of bring it down. It's the reason why going for a run works for us so much. Our body in contact, in rhythm with the ground, a rocking chair, a run, right? But it can be as small as these 2 fingers, starts to help us get out of our mind and back into our body. And I just noticed that this workshop, I must have done it about 5 times this year, just really took off. And it wasn't something that I did the previous year.
That's outstanding. So what we're really talking about as well then is having some level of self-awareness. And being to some extent attuned with oneself. So when it comes to so much of our time is outward facing, it's outward focus, especially in this age of rage where there's so many things that make everybody offended and upset. There's so much energy going outward. What are some steps to help to cultivate self-awareness that founders can start to work on?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have actual time with yourself. Like, are you spending any thinking time? Are you creating any time for you to just have focused work, right? You're turning off the Slack pings, you're turning off the phone calls, right? Are you sitting still at all? Something that I am working a lot with my leaders and founders on is, what is kind of been called the digital Sabbath, right? Are you unplugging on a regular basis? Ideally, it would be for 24 hours once a week, but some people have a hard time. So I'm like, step your way into that. Start with an hour. You can do an hour, start to double it. And in that time, I also recommend it would be nice if you could get outside, get outdoors. There is a lot of research about how being in nature and being surrounded by greenery is really actually calming and regulating for you. So I want you to disconnect from all of the dings and the pings, because that's one thing that keeps us jumpy. Right. And so you have to kind of actually practice sitting still, practice being bored. A book I read this year that I was fascinated by was Deep Work. And it came up in one of my founders groups, right? Like, to do hard things and to push through, we actually kind of have to practice not having this immediate response and immediate results.
That's good. Now let's talk about, you're in the throes of failure, right? The business is not going well. It's not happening. You've got all of these things to figure out. When you're in the throes of failure, what are some things that you would, if you were coaching someone whose business is going down, how would you advise them to start to handle and process that?
Yeah. I actually coached somebody through winding down their business this year. And it's not even because it was a failure. It's because they're meant to be doing something else. But I think it's really important to recognize that grief is present. And so some of the things that we went through is recognizing the stages of grief. Right? There's denial. There is depression, right? You will start to rebound, but I think it's really important in the same way that somebody wouldn't just be like, move on, get over it. If you had a death in your life, you are processing grief. And for us in this country, work, losing jobs, when something's not going right in your career, is one of the top 10 most grief-stricken things that we would experience. So I call on people to recognize that it is grief and deal with it appropriately. You might really need to slow down your pace. You are going to have to take things one step at a time till you start to feel better and the energy comes back. So we start to figure out what is the most important thing that you need to do and focus on the urgent and important matrix, and start to not worry about everything else. And we're going to move through things in one step at a time, just like you would if you were experiencing a major death in your life.
That's good. And then, so conversely, for that person who is watching or listening to this and they have not been able to start, they've not been able to launch that product or start that company that they've been working on for a long time, sort of in the background, what advice would you give them to get this kicked off in 2025?
Yeah. So I would say, how do you test? Right? How can you just have a nibble? If it is like more of a product business, can you do a little pop up and just see if people come and buy, right? Like, test the waters to see if it's something that you might want to do. If it's more of a service-based business, right? Can you have a trial? Can you have an offer? Can you just do one webinar? I think it's the same thing. It's one little step. But I think for the fear to get started, I want to kind of add a layer, right? I would love for you to, take one step and just get started and get some feedback, right? Because if that feedback is positive, it is really going to be the wind beneath your wings. It's going to help fuel you. You're going to love that feeling. You're going to be with your customers. You're going to remember why this is your calling and your purpose, and you're going to want that feeling again, right? But once you do that, I would encourage you to set like a milestone, right? If the business starts to hit $5,000 a month, then I'm going to put more time and resources in. If it hits, $100,000 a year, right? That's what I did. So for my business to get started, I had an exit with a company, thankfully. So I started with a little bit of seed money. So I didn't have a bunch of pressure to be able to live off of my business immediately. So set some realistic goals. But then once I said, listen, I was in corporate and I scaled businesses for a living. I did it over a decade. I'm really good at this. So if I can make $100,000 in this business in 1 year, I have a real business. I was able to do that in the first 6 months. Right. And so I think it's really important once you set a milestone for people who have a fear of launching, don't you move that milestone. OK, then that's a real, don't say no, 150. No, 200. Set that milestone and stick to it and look at what's working and really start to double down on that effort.
So you mentioned, sort of tied to that, but you mentioned a little bit earlier about the fear of judgment,
Yes.
Of what other people will think. How other people might reject what it is that you're putting out there. Mm-hmm. What are some ways or techniques that founders or intended founders can overcome that fear of people judging their product harshly or judging their service harshly? And maybe that's the reason they haven't been able to launch.
Yeah. Consider the audience. And I think this is in business and life. Is that your ICP? Is that your, customer profile that you are really targeting, right? If that is, then that's feedback that you should probably pay attention to, right? Does the market not want this? Is it not at the right price, right? But if it's not your ICP, then it's the noise. It's not the signal, right? You have to think about who you are building for, and you need to be maniacally focused on that. And it is really okay not to be for everybody. And I think it's even important, and it could be a trap to try to build for everybody. In business, we often talk about like a land and expand. Who is that customer target that you want to build for and satisfy? And once you feel like you are at a repeatable process with that audience, then you can think about kind of the next audience. So I want you to be maniacally focused on your audience. And if it's not your people, then consider the source. It might not be relevant information to you at the time.
And if it is your people, if that is your ideal customer profile or ICP, and they're not going for what you're putting out there, then that's important feedback, right?
That's very important.
Either you don't have the right product for the market, or there's just no market for your product. Maybe it tweaks, maybe it's not at all. And I think we look at that as, because that's a form of failure, that then becomes sort of a trigger. So I'd rather run this hamster wheel and tweak, never release, because I don't have to worry about somebody telling me that I've spent my time in a way that isn't profitable. I just wasted a whole bunch of time. But isn't that just a step on the road? If not this thing, maybe something else.
Yeah. And, you hit upon something that I think is really important, which is you have to get out there and talk to your customers so that you're building something relevant, right? Sometimes we do think we need this perfect product to release, but there are great products that don't sell. And I'm going to and there are very average and MAP products that sell because they have really good sales and marketing, right? So this illusion that the product has to be perfect is just not the case. And I think you can just look at basic common use cases. The first iPhone is not the generation we're on, right? So again, set a milestone that you would be comfortable with. Stick to that milestone. Don't keep moving it on yourself, and then launch and get that feedback, because that feedback is so important. And sometimes internally, what we think is going to be the wow thing is not the wow thing. I used to be a product marketer. And so I used to always go present to product and engineering teams. And I used to irritate them in a way, but I used to say, listen, you want to tweak the engine to go from 100 to 175 in 2.5 seconds, right? But my customer might only be going to the grocery store in this car and really wants more trunk space or really wants another color because they can't see that engine and they're not going above 30 anyway. Right. And that, right. So you can be spending all your time like performance. It's like, we're not built in for a race car driver.
Right. Right. That's really good. So you talked a couple of times about setting that goal and not moving that milestone, which brings to my mind accountability and the role of having accountability partners, whether that is a coach, a mentor, or a peer entrepreneur. Can you talk a little bit about the role of having accountability partners and the different value different types of accountability partners can bring?
Yeah, I think it's a huge value. And I would say I almost didn't even understand it until I became an entrepreneur. I was like, why does everybody have a business coach and a this and a that? But when you're in someone else's business and it is fairly mature, you have those accountability systems built in, right? You have a staff meeting, you have a quarterly review, you have targets that you're moving towards, you have the one-to-ones, especially if you're early days and you're just getting started. Sometimes we don't have the structure of how do I take this bigger goal and break it down to digestible pieces and making sure that I am moving the ball forward every day or every week, every month, every quarter. And how do I even get in a perspective on, am I doing the thing that moves the needle the most, right? I coached a founder one time that, had an e-commerce thing and spent so much time updating websites and daily deals and all of that kind of stuff. But overall, it was not, all of the time and activity was not making net new revenue dollars for the business. So sometimes we can get caught up in like, here is a ping and I have to address the most time sensitive, urgent things, but it's not important. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important. The role of accountability can be one to set up a structure so that you have the tools and the frameworks you need to take this bigger goal and break it down on what should I be doing on a daily basis. Two, it can serve to give you perspective on as you feel like you've gotten stuck in something that feels so important. Is it really moving the needle or not? I also think accountability groups, circles, can be really great for generating new ideas. What's working for other people? What haven't you thought of? How do you get that brainstorming collaboration, especially if you're really early and you don't have the team and thought partners within your company already?
Yeah. And when it comes to especially those intended founders, those individuals who should be launching but have struggled with the ability to launch, saying that if this business generates X, I will do Y, saying that to somebody else and not to yourself, not just to yourself, allows for somebody else to say, but wait, you said this is what you're supposed to be doing next. Or even what I have found, because I've acted as an accountability partner to some people, you said you were going to accomplish these things, but you're not taking steps in that direction.
That's right.
Because we can oftentimes get caught up in being busy without really being busy on the right things, right? It is the illusion of progress. I'm busy all day long. I must be doing something. Wow, but you're not doing the right things. Right. And so for a founder, that's like the kiss of death. Right.
I call it productive avoidance.
I like
the things that you would never do. And it's like all of a sudden when it's time for you to do the high leverage work that you're afraid, you're like, I'm going to organize my drive. I am going to get to zero inbox. It's like the things you never want to do that all of a sudden it is so important when you have to do the work that scares you.
Yeah, that sounds like some stuff I've done. So when somebody's dealing with a fear, can you think of maybe one or two things that they can do to help a quick mindset shift in that process?
Yeah, I think a quick mindset shift would be starting to identify, like, what am I afraid of? This thing in front of me, or does this feel familiar from something else, right? And again, I think that this is business, life, relationships. Like, are you judging the situation you're in, or is this reminding you of something that was painful? So I think that that's one thing, like, what is it? Is it this or is it something else? Because if it's something else, that may not be related to this work context, this situation, this issue. And so that could be something that's really helpful to ground us. And then I would go back to what's the worst that could happen?
What is one myth about entrepreneurship that you could just kick out of our minds right now?
Yeah, I think one myth is that people aren't afraid, especially successful people, that they don't have fear. I don't think any of this is about getting rid of our fear. I think that this is about not letting our fear control us.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we see the success stories and we get this glossed over high production value reenactment of what it was like when they were growing their business, and they were fearless and they're like just getting it done. And then we're sitting here cowering at our desks worrying about, is this business going to work? And that doesn't align with the image that we've been sold. So that's a really good point. I think the only people who aren't afraid of anything are psychopaths. And I don't think any one of us wants to be a psychopath.
I think that that's true. I also think it can be just so helpful to understand that successful people move through failure. I always think of there's a TikTok that goes around of Beyonce. It was like, you say I won the most Grammys, but I submitted and lost twice as many times than I actually won.
Yeah.
Michael Jordan, who did not make the basketball team first. Yeah. I think we try to avoid failure so much because it hurts. But in truth, because we spend so much time holding on to it, we learn the most when things don't go well. We sit and we actually force ourselves to reflect. When things go well, we don't actually often sit and reflect and dissect what worked.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I got one last question for you, Jeanette. What one book would you recommend people pick up for 2025 to help with this fear of failure, just to make them better leaders and better founders?
Oh, okay. One, it's hard. Can I name more than one?
Sure.
Okay. This is hard. Based on our conversation, a couple of books came up. One of my favorites is The Crossroads of Should and Must. And I touched on it before, but to me, it was so helpful to break down the difference between a job, a career, and a calling. Right. And when I was in a job season, not expecting my job to feed me in a way that a career and a calling does, but it also asks those questions when you're at a crossroads in your life, when you're at a pivot, when you're making changes. The book does a good job of asking you so many good, challenging questions that for me, sometimes when I'm afraid, I go back to this book again and again, and I'm like, yep. This is what I'm meant to be doing. This is why I need to push forward. So I think that that's one for someone who's at a crossroads and a pivot. Something else that came up for me during our conversation when we were talking about, are you a good leader? Are you micromanaging? Daring Greatly. I'm a big Brene Brown fan, and she has Daring Greatly talking about more of her leadership style book and how do you bring the vulnerability in the workplace. So if you're trying to get out of micromanaging and pointing the finger, I think vulnerability can be a big antidote. And it's going to be really hard to even identify, let alone address fear of failure if you're not being honest and authentic and vulnerable with yourself about some of these origin stories and where it comes from. I think the third one that came to mind as we were talking is Good to Great. And I think that there is a concept in the book that I love, that it's like, hey, as you are building a company, you need to get the right people on the bus is one, but you need to get the right people in the right seats. And so as you are thinking about growing and scaling and getting into that phase of your business, I think it can always be really helpful to go back to that concept of is the bus moving in the right direction? Do I have the right people on the bus? Do I have the right people in the right seats? So those are some of my favorites that I go back to for different reasons.
Yeah, those are really good. Those are really good. And I actually am as well a fan of Brene Brown, vulnerability and shame.
Yeah.
Shame really can keep us from doing great things, period. Full stop.
Yeah.
That embarrassment, that shame, it will hold you back every single time. And as I've said before, and I will say, and I say this to myself every single day, if you are worried about being shamed or if you're worried about embarrassment, you will never do the great things.
Yeah.
Because somebody's always going to have something to say about you. Somebody's always going to have a criticism. You're always going to rub somebody the wrong way. Somebody's always not going to like your products. The name of your company is dumb. What you're going about, trying to accomplish in the marketplace won't work. That's always going to be true, right? And yet we have these magnificent examples of companies and individuals who put all that aside and decided that they were going to do what they were going to do and not care about what anybody else said. So that thing with shame, I mean, it has a societal purpose, right? Because you don't want to be totally shameless.
Right.
It has a societal purpose, but we tend to overweight it.
Yeah.
And we tend to underweight vulnerability.
Yeah, you said something that sparked something in me. I remember hearing something that was like, hey, if you're not offending someone or pissing someone off or someone's not coming for you, you're probably not like living big enough, right?
Right.
Like if you like, it's emotion, right? Like the opposite of love is hate, right? But it's like, if you're just being in the neutral, you're not moving the needle for anybody. So in the same way that someone's going to hate you, you will find that audience that will have that passion and love you. But if you're just in the neutral, like think about a flat line, you're dead. Like you want some reaction and emotion to what you're doing. And if you're not pissing people off, it's probably not interesting enough. It's not big enough. It's not good enough, which I thought was a really great way to kind of reframe being afraid of the shame and the hate.
Yeah, we don't really like lukewarm anything, right? Like think about what would you prefer lukewarm?
Right.
Right. I mean, it doesn't work for any aspect of our lives. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Coach Jeanette. For those of you who are listening or watching, you can find more information about Coach Jeanette on the episode webpage, how to contact her, how to hire her. If you take nothing else away from this conversation today, think about the fact that you could probably benefit from a coach. You could probably benefit from an accountability partner. And in some way, shape, or form, the fear of failure is probably impacting how you are living your business and your best life. So thanks for listening and watching.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Anatomy of Failure. Today, we delved into the profound impact the fear of failure can have on how entrepreneurs lead and manage their teams. If today's conversation resonated with you, consider reaching out to Jeanette Jordan for coaching. You'll find her contact details and resources on this episode's webpage. And remember, failure is not the end. It's a stepping stone to growth. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could benefit from these insights. Remember, subscribers get a ton of benefits like access to comprehensive show notes, tools discussed in each episode, free webinars, and so much more. Check out my website, anatomyoffailurepodcast.com to learn more. In our next episode, we'll be discussing what can happen to a business when co-founders aren't aligned. Until next time, I'm Ivy Walker, reminding you leadership starts with self-awareness. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.